Well, it's been a little bit of a, to be honest, the whole book of Genesis has been a bit of a roller coaster, hasn't it? We think about how God created this world, and by Genesis 3, things have went downhill. In Genesis 3, of course, Adam and Eve sin against God, and the consequences of that are that they cannot remain in Eden. They can't remain in paradise. They now live east of Eden, and everything that happens in the Bible from here onwards is really just east of Eden. And so then we had Cain and Abel, and how Cain was jealous of his brother Abel and murdered him. We had human society materialize with Lamech. You remember Lamech? Lamech's the guy who invented polygamy, who came into his two wives and boasted of how he had murdered someone for, I don't know, looking at him in a wrong way. And he was evil, Lamech. And yet God was faithful to his promises in giving Eve a son, and that son's name at the end of chapter 4 was Seth. And so we're into chapter 5, and we are leaving the family line of Cain behind. And the focus has now moved to the family line of Seth, Adam's son Seth. And so, I don't know if you noticed, but in chapter 5 there is a ringing kind of resounding cry that you and I need to understand, and it's this. It's this, and then he died. We're making sense of what God said to Adam in chapter 2. He said, if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. And if you wondered what that looks like, if you wondered how the consequences, the outworking of that, then this is it. Chapter 5 is just this resounding claim that after incredible lifespans for us, right, that death was the end result. No person ever dies from natural causes. They die from the unnatural cause of Genesis 3. And so it's shocking, chapter 5, because what you were made for, what is your natural place, is that you were naturally made to dwell with God forever. And yet death is deeply unnatural. The consequences of sin is a mortal life out of step with God. And so chapter 5 teaches us that for all of humanity, you will surely die in Adam. That's exactly what Paul says. Paul, when he's writing in Romans, he says in Romans 5 that death entered the world through one man. And now we have the outworking of how death has entered the world. And death is always an intrusion in this world. God declared the world good, and it did involve death. And so that's why when death materializes or death pops up its head, it always brings grief. It always brings hardship. It always brings some suffering, because death is an intrusion on the world that God created. And so Genesis 5 wants us to understand that that as descendants of Adam, you and me, death will also be my experience. And that death really matters. And so there are three ways in which I think you and I respond to death. Okay? The first one is this. This is a Banksy picture. The I Love Life boy. Okay? I'm going to suggest that actually the first thing we do is that we ignore death. And there are genuine good reasons for that. And it's going to sound basic. It's because we really do love life. We love the wind in our hair, if we have hair. We love the beach at our feet. We love the people that we share time with. We love good food. We love singing. We love dancing, some of us. We love, some of us love work. We love rest. We love sports and literature and movies. We love our family. We love our gardens. We love to be outside. Insert your love here. And to frame the context of that, it's that God has given us life. We know that from Genesis 1 and 2, and it is a good gift. We are made to love life. And life can be difficult. Even in the midst of difficult life, people seem to love life, broadly speaking. The person who has chemotherapy says, I just want to be well. I want to enjoy the taste of food without the metallic in my mouth. The person who's come in with the kind of frame to help them walk goes, I just want to be able to walk again. I want to be able to do what I did as a child and climb a tree. Because deep down we actually love to be alive. Society recognizes in most contexts, it's a shame it's not in all contexts, that when someone says that I don't want to live anymore, there is something profoundly wrong. And so it turns out that people who love life don't want to lose life. And so we stick our head in the sand and we refuse to look death in the eye. We ignore it. I wonder how often you have thought about death. That was the invitation in the email this week. You've got 4,100 weeks in your life between when you're born and when you die. Are you thinking about that? And so Genesis 5 is prompting us to stop ignoring death. And yet we go beyond simply ignoring death. We trivialize death. This is Joseph Stalin, famous for, among lots of other things. I learned about Joseph Stalin as a teenager in A-levels. And he's famous for, among other things, causing a man-made famine that killed millions. That's a scary thing to be known for, isn't it? And he's said to have remarked that a single death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic. A single death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic. And that's profoundly true. Because death's presence on the front of news websites is near constant. Death casts its vast shadow over our world. And yet how often do we have serious conversations about death? We deal with statistics. Sometimes we deal with heartbreaking stories of loss. But we keep death at arm's length. I can live with a statistic that's 1 million. A single death is a tragedy. And so the reality is that you and I can trivialize death. I wonder what Methuselah, right? Methuselah in that list has the longest lifespan of anybody. 969 years. He's got to have struggled to take death seriously, right? If anybody can ignore death, surely it's Methuselah. He must have thought that this death thing was a myth or an old story. He was probably thinking about how he could make the most of his 1,000th birthday. That sounds great, doesn't it? He's thinking about how can I get a cake big enough to stick 1,000 candles into? I've been alive so long. What's death to me? And so we ignore death. That's the first thing we do. The second thing, maybe the reaction is that we flee death. There's a point when you struggle to ignore death, right? Subconsciously, we might drift into fleeing death before we're aware that's what we're doing. Maybe it's that we've experienced death in some powerful way and it's got us thinking about our own mortality. Or it's that we've become aware of that we aren't as agile or as capable as we used to be, that this body is starting to show some wear and tear. Perhaps we look at the candles in the birthday cake and we notice that we're running out of space. There's lots of ways we get there, but there is an instinct in us to flee from death. It's where we get that idea, isn't it, that you flee for your life. The fire alarm goes off. What are you going to do? You're going to flee for your life, aren't you? Because you value it. You actually love being alive. And one of the things that we flee into is modern medicine. And that's an appropriate response to being unwell and to needing care. Jesus himself said that the sick need a doctor. God has made mankind creative, that there are operations that can be done and medicine that can be taken that can prolong life. Isn't that incredible? But statistically, modern medicine has changed the way we die. It's amazing that it has allowed people to live much longer. But modern medicine cannot guarantee quality of life. And you'll notice that there's a distinction between the quality of your life and the value of your life. Your value is intrinsic. It never changes. You might feel like the quality of your life is just nosedived, but the value of your life remains the same. It's a duty and responsibility of us to increase the quality of someone's life. And yet modern medicine can only do so much, because modern medicine can only hold death at bay. It cannot stop death from coming. Culturally, we might run for our lives. You suddenly start going to the gym, or you've signed up to Park Run. You suddenly have to start eating salads and cut down on red meat in McDonald's. You aren't drinking full-fat milk anymore. If you ask someone why they're doing that, they might say, well, I'm trying to lose weight, or I'm watching my health, or I'm cutting down on my sugars, or I'm not drinking as much wine as I used to drink. They want a better quality life. They want a prolonged life. They subconsciously, even if they can't say it, they are fleeing death. This picture's about how to put off heart disease. That's a polite way of saying how to make sure my heart doesn't kick it and I can enjoy my life. And so even subconsciously we're fleeing death. This is Walter White. I don't know if you've ever seen Breaking Bad. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, okay? It's not a wholesome kind of show. But Walter White is a chemistry teacher, and he's diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he has semi-noble intentions. He intends to leave his family with enough money that they would survive, or that they'd be able to live without the provision that he brings. His choice of what to do for that's a little bit questionable. He decides to become a drug dealer, okay? He basically goes, I'm a really good chemist in the classroom. I'm going to use these skills and basically make meth. That's what he does. And so he begins by going, this is the number, it's something like $500,000 or something. This is the number that my family will need. He's calculated to the last detail what my family will need when I'm gone. And you get to the end of the show, and it's been this massive kind of roller coaster. If you wanted to see it, you would have. You get to this massive roller coaster, and his wife eventually finds out. It tanks his marriage. But the two of them, him and his wife, as their marriage is failing, kind of come into this little kind of industrial warehouse. And they stand there, and there's this just massive pile of money. And she basically goes, there's more money here than we could ever use, but there's more money here than we could ever wash and make look legit. And he looks at it and he says to her, I think it's really profound, he says to her, do you remember how it began? It began with, I'm doing this to earn money for my family. He ends and says to her, this wasn't about money. This was about me proving myself. This was about me living. I fled death and ran into things that make me feel alive. He just wanted to be alive. And so he threw himself into what gave him life. And so isn't that true of all of us? That actually, that can be true of all of us, that we run into the things that make us feel alive. We flee death by pursuing all the things that make us feel alive. And that reaction makes a lot of sense. Because we are made to love life. We don't want to die. And yet at some point we can't run away anymore. And so we do the last thing I think we do, which is to disarm death. We live in a world where when I die and how I die are more often now talked about as choices to be made. That's why culturally society is moving towards the introduction of assisted suicide. Because it seeks to disarm death. We want to take the misery out of death. We want to take the suffering out of death. We want those things out of the equation. We want to be able to say that death hasn't mastered me, I have mastered death. I've outwitted death. I'm going to die on my own terms. And it's understandable, isn't it? Because death can be immensely destructive. Death can be incredibly painful. Death is scary. Of course, there's a desire in us to disarm that. Wouldn't it be great if we could remove all the suffering and all the fear? Wouldn't it be great to reduce death to a momentary drift and nothing more? What we want to be able to do is to say, "O death, where is your sting? O death, where is your victory? I've wrapped death in so much bubble wrap that death is no longer an enemy to be feared." Death is like this. Death is like a scorpion. I've stuck some gloves on death's pincers so that death's destructive power becomes nothing. I've mastered him. I pop a pill. I sit in a pod. Death has no sting. So I can laugh at death because I haven't just lived my way, I've died my way. "O death, where is your sting? O death, where is your victory?" And yet, where does the sting of death actually come from? Not the pincers, as painful as they can be, and some deaths are horrific, right? But the sting comes from the tail. The pincers have us, but the tail sweeps in from above and delivers death's sting. I can't wrap death in bubble wrap. I can't disarm the destructive power of death. Because the sting of death isn't death. The sting of death is sin. That's what it says in Corinthians. The worst thing about death is not that the physical body perishes. It's that death's sting is to leave me exposed and defenseless for all of eternity in my sin. So that I face the righteous judgment of God. Romans 12 says that, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned, right? It begins with sin. Romans 6 says that for the wages of sin is death. It begins with sin. I don't have a death problem. I have a sin problem. If something can be done about sin, then the power of death is disarmed. It is my sin that makes death deadly. And so I can never really disarm death, no matter how much bubble wrap I put on the experience of death. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't die valued or cared for. But it does mean that we need to be honest that all death stings. Because all death brings me face to face with my sin. And so what is the hope, right? I try to disarm death. What is the hope? Well, I'm going to suggest we think about it from Genesis 5 and 6. Let's deal with the elephant in the room first, right? Let's deal with Genesis chapter 6. I think that one of the things that we can find that there is hope is that God has curtailed the wickedness of humanity. You get this really strange passage, don't you, in chapter 6? In some ways, what I'm going to say is that I'll give you a sense of what it might be, and then say I have no idea. All right, that seems like a good thing to do. There are sometimes passages, and this is definitely one of them. This might be one of the strangest little sections in the entire of the Bible. Who are these sons of God, right? Well, they might be the sons of Seth, but that seems unlikely because it wouldn't be noteworthy to mention that the sons of Seth are now taking wives. That would be a bit weird. It might be that it's marriages between believers who hold the promise that's given to Eve and people who don't. It might be, and it seems like it might be angels. I don't know. For our purposes, what I want us to see is really what you get is just how sinful the world is becoming. Right? The trajectory of what happened in the garden and has been heading out, it is getting worse. Right? So it explains why we're going to get to to the rest of chapter 6 and into chapter 7 and find what happens with Noah. Because the trajectory is getting worse. And so what I want us to understand is that God gets to the end of this bit of chapter 6 and he curtails the wickedness of humanity by locking, in some way, shape, or form, their age. Can you imagine Joseph Stalin? He lived until he was 77. He has millions of people who have died under his rule. Can you imagine what would happen if he lived till 969? Can you imagine the evil that would have been true? God looks at humanity and says, I'm not going to let these guys live for that long because their wickedness is just immense. That's God's judgment, right? But that is also God's mercy to shield people from that. And so that's what I think is happening, right? You can have a think about what you think is going on there too. Interested for conversation. We'll probably end up just we'll find out in the kingdom. Second thing that's going on, right, and I think it's really helpful, is that we recognize that God is patient and purposeful. These are really, it's one of the things about this passage, isn't it? You look and you go, how on earth does somebody live for 969 years? These ages are insane, aren't they? And yet part of it is that God is patient and purposeful. This man who lives 969 years, who's waiting for his 1000th birthday, his name is really important to us. Methuselah, which means when I die, it comes. Right? When I die, it comes. Well, what on earth's going on? Methuselah dies in the year that water comes. Lots of it. In the year of the flood of Noah. His entire life has purpose because his entire life is a counter to the patience of God. From the moment he's born till the moment he dies is a reminder of just how gracious God is. That God's redemption purposes are unfolding and that they take time. Every millisecond of his life has something to do with God's mercy. Something to do with what God is doing in this world. And that's true of us as well. That isn't true of just a man who's lived for 969 years. That's true of every single one of us who lives about 120 is the max that anybody has ever lived. 122, I think, is scientifically how long someone has been recorded to have lived. I think there's claims that someone made it to 150, but it's never been verified. But every millisecond counts because God is doing saving work, maybe in the life of the individual, maybe in the life of the people around them, maybe in the life of a nation, broadly speaking, in the life of our world. And so that's actually one of the reasons why this assisted suicide thing is so evil. Because if every millisecond God is doing his work, who am I to cut God's work at the knees? It's his to do. but it reminds us of just how patient and gracious God really is in the face of wickedness. And if he's gracious to Methuselah, then he's gracious to me. And the last one we're going to think about, right? So this is, we'll come back to this in a minute. The antidote to death is God himself. That is what is the anomaly of chapter 5? What is the anomaly of chapter 5? The anomaly of chapter 5 is in verse 24, isn't it? One man somehow finds refuge from death. One person doesn't die. Enoch. Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more because God took him away. Where does he find refuge? He finds refuge in God's grace. Can you imagine the search party for Enoch as his family try to understand where he's disappeared to? Where did that young 365-year-old go? Is he up a tree? Do you know, it's really interesting because Enoch actually lives less than half the lifespan of anybody else on this list. Everybody else seems to hit their 900s, except for a different Lamech who, I don't know if he was a smoker or something, but he only made it to 777. I don't know what happened there, but somehow here is Enoch, and Enoch's young, relatively speaking, by this world's standards, and yet he's missing. And Hebrews 11 helps us to understand what has happened. Hebrews 11 tells us that by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found. There you go. They searched, but they couldn't find him because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. How is it that Enoch has broken the pattern of Genesis 5? What hope is there for me? Well, he was taken from this life because he was commended as one who pleased God. In some ways, the language of chapter 5, when it comes to Enoch, feels a bit familiar, doesn't it? It feels a little bit like the language we were used to in chapter 2, where Adam walked with God. I think there's something slightly different going on there. This isn't a parallel like for like. But it seems to be that those who trust in the promises of God, those who, like Eve, do you remember what she named Cain, this is the boy? Those who trust in the promises of God are described as walking with him in the Bible. And it's interesting because those who are, everybody in the Bible, everybody in history is on the move, okay? And it's either you're walking with God or you're walking in darkness. That's the way it kind of brings itself. Everybody's on the move. And so it's true in Isaiah 9, that famous Christmas kind of, you always look at the Christmas, don't you? But the people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, or sometimes it's translated in the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You were in your sin, but now you're trusted in the promises of God because God has brought forth his Messiah, his rescuer. Psalm 23 is a psalm that psalm that we sang together a moment ago. It is a psalm on the move. What does it say? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You lead me by still waters. You are with me. You prepare a place for me in the presence of my enemies. What does that sound like? It's not just that I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death. It's that God is walking there too. He's come along for the journey. The person who finds salvation, who finds refuge from their enemies, who finds refuge, is that they find refuge in God. It's the person who walks in him, who trusts in his promises. And Jesus says this in John chapter 8. Jesus says this. He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. It's the trusting in the promises again. Whoever believes in me and trusts in the promises. And so I walk in darkness or I walk in God's promises. Those are the two options. And so in Hebrews, when it talks about Enoch by faith Enoch did this. It's by faith in the promise of a rescuer. And in the cross, in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, Jesus takes the sting of death. Right? We've said that the actual power of death is the sting. Okay? Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane just before he dies, and he talks about this cup. And it's metaphorical. He talks about this cup of judgment. That's like the venom, isn't it? That's the venom of death. That's sin. And it belongs to me and you because we rightfully deserve to be condemned for our sin. And yet Jesus says, I'll drink this cup. I'll go on the cross and die that all of your judgment, all of that sting might fall upon me. That my death no longer leads to condemnation because his death led to condemnation. But instead my death leads to life in all of its fullness. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection of the life. He who believes in me may never die, but he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? He's talking about the death of Lazarus. There was we went to, some of us went to a conference a year ago. And in the conference they were talking about resurrection because of course Jesus doesn't just deal with my death, he smashes death. And the speaker brought up a table. And he was talking about Lazarus, who's a friend of Jesus, and he dies. And Jesus arrives 4 days late, which is a way in which you could go, he really is dead, this Lazarus guy. And Jesus says, Lazarus, come out of the tomb. I am the resurrection of life. And he comes out and he's wearing the garments of burial. Right? He's wearing, I don't know if it's like a mummy or if it's something else, but he's wearing the burial robes when he comes out. Because he's come out the way he went in. But Jesus literally goes through death. Which is why when Jesus is raised from death, he's not robed in burial clothes. The burial clothes are on the side. Because Jesus disarms death. Jesus smashes death. It's amazing, isn't it? Because we have a God who is deeply concerned about death. Okay, he meets us in our grief. This is some words from C.S. Lewis in The Silver Chair, which is one of the. Anyone ever read it? Okay, that's all right. Excellent. Paul at the back, keen bean. It's quite far in the Narnia series, so you'd be forgiven for not getting there. This is what it says. He says that this is talking about King Caspian dies on the beach. You're not going to watch Breaking Bad. You're not going to watch this. King Caspian dies on the beach, okay? And it says, then Aslan stopped, and the children looked into the stream. And there on the golden gravel of the bed on the stream lay King Caspian dead. But the water flowing over him like liquid glass. His long white beard swayed in it like waterweed. And all three stood and wept. So this is the children. They're all weeping over the death of King Caspian. And Jesus is, and the lion is, for C.S. Lewis, the lion is Jesus, okay? Even the lion wept. Great lion tears. Each tear more precious than the earth would be if it was a single solid diamond. Because God actually really does care about death. He does not take delight in death. That's one of the reasons, I think, why people live so long to begin with. Why death seems so distant. It's because God does not delight in death. Jesus doesn't delight in death. Jesus weeps at death. And then this is what it says. This is continuing that story on the beach. At the same moment, a doleful music stopped, and the dead king began to be changed. His white beard turned grey, and from grey to yellow, and got shorter and vanished altogether. And his sunken cheeks grew round and fresh, and the wrinkles were smoothed, and his eyes opened, and his eyes and lips both laughed. And suddenly he leaped and stood before them, a very young man. Jesus disarms death. Jesus turns death into the way in which people enter the kingdom. Isn't that amazing? Like, oh death, where is your sting? Oh death, where is your victory? It's not just that death doesn't have that claim on me anymore, but Jesus turns the enemy into the one in whom is going to bring into the kingdom. I'm going to go through death into the other side to be in his kingdom. And out of God's compassion comes action. Jesus does not delight in death, and out of his action comes compassion. Out of his compassion comes action. And so Jesus has destroyed death. We're going to have one more quote, and that's us. It's dangerous, isn't it? I can treat trusting in Jesus like a get out of jail free card. I've made a confession. I'm going to stick it in my pocket, and I'm never going to think about Jesus again. And when I get to death, and I go through death, I'm going to pull out this card and show it and go, Jesus died for me. Does that feel like what it looks like to walk with Jesus? I don't think there's any reason to have any confidence in that. Does that look like what it is to walk with God? To trust in his promises? To be a disciple of Jesus? And so we need to be careful, right? We need to be careful about what we are trusting in. By faith, Enoch did not trust in a card. He trusted in the Son. He trusted in relationship with Jesus. Even when he didn't know Jesus' name, he knew that there would be a rescuer. So this is the last one, right? George Herbert, right? George Herbert is a poet and does some literature, and obviously not recent, okay? And he wrote this. He said, "Death used to be an executioner, but the gospel makes him just a gardener. Death used to be able to crush us, but now all death can do is plant us in God's soil so that we become something extraordinary. Death used to be an executioner, but the gospel makes him a gardener." That is what it looks like for Jesus to disarm death. Death used to be able to crush us, but now all death can do is to plant us in God's soil so that we become something extraordinary. Jesus disarms death. I wonder if you think about those three things. Do you ignore death? Do you flee from death? Are you trying to disarm death yourself? And I think there are other ways in which we try to disarm death. So we talked about how we try to make death unpainful, and maybe there are other ways we do that. We try to change where death leads. So we go, it doesn't lead to judgment, it just leads to nothingness. It leads to non-existence, or it leads to a new cycle in which I'll become somebody else. in some of our form. There are lots of ways we try to disarm the reality of death and the sting of death. It's incredible what Jesus has done. It is worth today thinking about death. 4,100 weeks in the average life of a person. You're not going to get 696 years. 669 years. Sorry. And it's worth thinking, what happens to me when I die? Let me pray. Father, we just want to thank you for Jesus. We want to thank you for the hope that we have in him in a world where we are surrounded by reminders of death. We think about Genesis chapter 5. We think about how that rings true. Then he died, then he died, then he died. And we look around us and we look around our world and we can see then he died written all over it. We can see then he died written on BBC News and on Sky News. We look in our families and in our friends and we recognize those words, then he died, then he died. And all of it because of sin. Not your design, not how you made this world to be, but because of our sinfulness. And yet you in your mercy promised that one day death would be defeated. Promised that all of this would be made right. Promised that there would be a people who would be your possession. That we would once again walk with you in intimacy and in closeness. And all of that possible through a rescuer. All of that possible through your anointed one, your Messiah, this child promised to Eve, who would crush the serpent's head, who would crush death itself. And we thank you that child was Jesus, your son, your precious son. And so we pray that today you would convict us of our sin. We pray you would convict us of the consequences of our sin. We pray we would realize just how serious death is. But we thank you for the hope that Jesus offers us. We thank you that he is the resurrection and the life. We thank you that in him, death is disarmed. And we just give thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.